So this is going to be the first episode of a two-part series just on where the state comes from, how it forms, how it works, and what its purpose is. And this first episode is going to be on the liberal political ontology and its purpose, which is the open society. So I want to start by talking about Rousseau and also various thinkers in the Enlightenment, specifically in regarding to this concept of the state of nature, which is this idea that came about during the 1700s that before the state, human beings were just living as wild animals in nature, and they were totally free and ungoverned and individualist, and they only met up briefly to procreate. Now, obviously, this is, with modern anthropology, this is disproven. Pre-modern peoples have always lived in tribes, but Rousseau and John Locke and Hobbes tend to think that it's necessary to talk about for their social contract theory and their liberal theory that people will just say, like, okay, truce, all right, we're not gonna kill each other, or we're not gonna just be wild men. We're going to secure each other's freedoms in some kind of alliance. And that tends to be how liberals think about the state. Even today, they tend to think about it just as an alliance to keep people safe or to keep their property safe. Another concept that came out of the Enlightenment was blank slate individualism, something that liberals today still believe in. It is the concept that when you are born without any kind of pre-programmed characteristics. Your entire life is what programs your characteristics. And therefore, culture, education, material status, how your parents treated you, these things determine behavior and aren't determined by behavior, right? So like the inverse would be that your culture is something that is derived from your society's behavior and you inherit certain behaviors from your parents, right? That would be the direct inverse of blank slate individualism. And we here in the West tend to subscribe to blank slate individualism. That's where you get certain thinkers like John Locke and even Sigmund Freud. His psychoanalytic theories tend to deal with the individual as something that can kind of be programmed almost and has no inherent nature. So this is kind of more of a metaphysical side tangent, but I wanted to draw parallels between materialism and liberalism. So with everything that I've told you now, treating all individuals just as sort of blank slates as qualitatively equal in a certain way, that means that the conclusion we would draw from blank slate individualism and this state of nature is that everyone is, in a certain respect, equal, and the only difference, really, in certain aggregates would be external conditions and quantitative differences, amounts of people. This is generally how liberals tend to think things ought to be decided, is through quantity. So an example of this would be voting. They think that just the amount of people, the slight majority, would be enough to secure truth. They think that like the economy should be run by pure quantitative calculations, voting with your dollar, and just generally treating people like money. Like the subject of politics is the individual who is universal, who is abstract, blank, and can go anywhere and basically have the same amount of value. So the parallel between materialism and liberalism would be that the materialist starts with the smallest possible material object. If you want to call that the quantum, or the like a vibrating string of energy, or like a subatomic particle, whatever you want to fill in. It's the piece of matter that if you just took a normal piece of matter and then you just kept cutting it in half, this is like the classic ancient Greek concept of materialism, that if you just kept cutting an object in half, eventually you'd get to an atom, that's what they called it, which is just an object that you can't cut in half. It's the smallest possible object. And so the materialist starts with the point that is smallest, most simple, and most universal. And it says, like, okay, well, the entire universe, all complexity, all structure and life just comes from random collisions between these small objects, and they just aggregate. And so everything is just an aggregate of small objects. And so it sort of deconstructs both of these perspectives, materialism and liberalism, both deconstruct structures, larger structures, just to their smallest possible part. Whether or not this is like a sustainable worldview or not, it's just saying that it's just the belief that the larger structure exists for the smallest possible structure. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to see both worldviews. And my opinion is that it doesn't explain too much about these structures themselves. So what is identity under liberalism? It seems clear that anything that is structured and collective, any kind of identity that is inherited from your parents, from your culture, your language, religion, whatever, these things are not things that we choose necessarily. They're things that choose us. We're a part of them. But under liberalism, this is completely inverted. It puts the individual above everything else and says, no, this group is just made out of individuals. We're not cells in the group. This group exists for us, and all identity just relates to the individual. So liberalism is very tolerant of different types of individuals, but they're intolerant of a truly collective identity, just philosophically and socially, not in any formalized legal sense all of the time, but certainly in this philosophical sense. They alienate and isolate the individual from their organic group, what is naturally theirs, because they naturally belong to that group, right? That's the true essence of a group, is that you belong to it, but liberals will just see groups as alliances between individuals, and we'll see the ramifications of this. So the concept that groups just serve as alliances, either economic alliances for trade or for the preservation of private property, or as military or police alliances to just keep human bodies safe. This concept has sort of a neutrality baked into it, that liberals think that the state itself is just a neutral arbiter, and what individuals do is really not the state's business. And this usually gets brought up in liberal circles, but there are extreme versions of this wherever liberalism tends to fail at this, which it often does. Most societies will actually fail at the pursuit of like a complete neutrality in power structures, because it's just there simply is no such thing as neutrality. But liberalism will attempt this, and then libertarianism will try and solve where it thinks liberalism failed, which is essentially a critique of liberalism from a more liberal standpoint. And before you get mad, I'm not saying liberal like a progressive. I'm talking about the philosophy of liberalism. And if you look at the word liberal, it just means laissez-faire. It means to not control. And libertarian is sort of an extreme version of this then, where it says, well, the state should be more neutral. It should be more drawn back out of people's lives, and it should just be a police force to protect people's property and prevent murder and stuff. Whether or not this is proven as a legitimate use for the state or not, they'll still go deeper into their Enlightenment theory about this being the perfect use of the state. And then anarchists even more so, right? So anarchists will have an extremer view of the state, and they'll say, well, it's actually the state's problem, and human society is really just about an alliance of individuals. They'll still take that kind of liberal line usually, and they'll say like collective identity is something you choose, and inherited identity is some kind of meta-narrative put onto us. And again, this sort of alliance that doesn't penetrate personal lives is a very liberal concept. To just have like a militia or a local economy that doesn't intervene in personal lives is very indicative of this state of nature and this alliance that comes from it. So a way that you can think of libertarianism, liberalism, and anarchism is they're sort of politics of the negative, where they think that they can just take a step back, and that's their political stance. And they do this with like free speech, for example, or the free market, where you just take a step back. It's a negative action, and you expect that there's some kind of natural process that's self-regulating or direct the people towards truth. When in reality, you're not just not doing something. You are, in effect, through this negative action, securing something. All negative actions are secretly positive actions, and you are securing something that maybe you don't like. And so the solution then would be to secure something that you actually do like through more deliberate positive actions. Globalist cosmopolitan liberalism asserts that something true, meaning universal and eternal, has been discovered, and that this is the core assumption of liberalism. So that's blank slate theory, that's this state of nature, that's placing the individual at the heart of all human interaction. And this is fundamentally the product of a specific culture, not a discovery of all human beings. This is why we go to other countries and discover something that is radically different, radically humanitarian, and we're shocked by this because we have to cope and we have to say like, oh wow, well this must be because they're not educated. They haven't discovered John Locke like we have. But we are an Anglo culture. Liberalism comes from Anglo culture, and Western European culture broadly speaking. But Thomas Hobbes and Locke were Anglos, and Rousseau is a Frenchman. But it's a very Western European concept that you should put the individual at the heart of all community. And so that's what I mean when I say that the tolerance that we have is only a tolerance of individuals and not of other groups, because when they think differently in this fundamental way and they act differently, they become a threat to the liberal organism in that sense. So tolerance then can't really be a universal trait because certain group behaviors are mutually exclusive. So if all groups are made out of individuals, there would be no issue in just combining whole societies because they would just function in a way that's best for each specific individual. But what we see is that individuals grow up in specific societies that have their maximized way of functioning and do not interface cleanly into other societies because people are not blank slate individuals. They're not cogs to be replaced. They're not parts of a machine. They're organic products of their people and of their culture. And so they have organic ties to some groups and not others, right? Like, you're only the child of your parents. You're not the child of anyone. And your child can only be your child, and they're not the child of anyone. And there are certain things that just aren't replaceable, and you can't make people act like machines in this way. And that's really what I mean when I say that it's inorganic. Like, the liberal political theory is just inorganic at its core. And this concept that individuals just make up neutral alliances and that public space is neutral is just it's just the product of a specific Anglo culture, right? It relies on the goodwill of the neighbors that you've grown up around. So that specific cultural adaptation is one that is situational, and it's one that relies on the goodwill of other groups when they come to interact with the liberal culture. If the state represents collective resources, right, with tax money, with public land and whatnot, we can think of it as a sort of commons, right? So the tragedy of the commons is the idea that there is this collective land that multiple people with herds can take their cows to, and they can feed and graze. And because it's collective property, the theory goes that each individual herdsman will let their cows graze as much as they want because it's just collective property, and they themselves have no personal responsibility to the collective property. So each farmer lets their cattle eat as much as they want, and eventually the collective resource depletes. And this assumes that the farmers themselves don't have contact with each other, and that they don't have sort of their own implicit social contract that regulates this sort of thing. It doesn't have to be a written out contract determining who gets how much, but it can be more of a subtle cultural thing. And so going back to the state as a collective resource, we see ourselves as just a collection of individuals, and that this is just a collective resource we can all use, and we just sort of expect that people use it in a certain way. But this is just that, it's an expectation. When this expectation is subverted, we have built a society with no real defense mechanism against this, and we will treat any other group as just a collection of individuals, and we expect that they will do the same for us, and we'll expect that there is just fair competition between all individuals globally, which is of course naive, and it's also imperialistic, because when this expectation is not met, sometimes liberal countries will go out and maraud and quote-unquote spread freedom to make sure that those other non-liberal countries will open up, and that there will be an open society where there's a free competition of abstracted individuals that can go anywhere and start any business. But also when groups themselves don't have the strategy and they come into a liberal society, they will have a more collectivist strategy and play off of the divided culture and alienated culture of liberal countries. So they will be more of a stronger collective, more of a stronger community, and succeed because they're up against an enemy that has willingly blinded themselves to the concept of community. And so there is a paradox of tolerance in this, right? Karl Popper talks about the open society and a paradox of tolerance. The open society being, like I said, the fully tolerant society of individuals, but intolerant of these collective identities because these collective identities, religion, populism, nationalism, stand in the way of the fully individualist, liberal society where everybody can do whatever they want. And the paradox of tolerance is are you going to be tolerant? Is a liberal society going to be tolerant of intolerance? Is the liberal society going to be tolerant of the communities that are exclusive and say, like, well, we don't want this. We want to live our own specific way. And there seems to be a schizophrenic response to this, which is either going to other countries and forcing them to be like us, which always ends in disaster. There's not been a successful grafting of our culture onto others. Or we expect other people coming here to then immediately take on to our culture, which then also has disastrous effects because there is friction, and other people, of course, are going to have different expectations of what happens in public and how one ought to act, and the result from this can only be a sort of cultural division, which liberals are just not understanding of at all, because for them, they want people to act like machines. They want people to just immediately switch over to a materialistic, individualistic economy and society, and this is cruel, I think. So liberalism is now faced with two distinct options. Either stick to quote-unquote neutrality between different identities and allow liberalism to be eaten by communities that do not share its values, harboring like mutually exclusive lifestyles, or actively defend its own culture as a distinct culture from others and adopt characteristics that might, what we would consider, contradict liberalism, like tolerance and universalism, and liberalism would then have its saving grace in what is not liberal. It would understand itself as something that is particular and cultural, and it would transform into something new entirely as a means of protecting itself. So the liberal culture, if it's something that's valuable at all, if any part of it is valuable, it actually has to ditch the parts of it that are not valuable and don't serve itself as a means of protecting what is truly good in it, if there's anything at all that is truly good in liberal culture. So this is my critique of the open society, liberalism, and at least this aspect of Enlightenment philosophy. I'm going to be doing another episode on the Aristotelian state and how the family organically grows into an extended family, towns, cities, nations, and this alternative, more ancient theory that the state actually comes from a specific people. If you're interested in this sort of thing, like, comment, subscribe. Let's talk about it. Thank you for watching.